All right. Very pleased to have our next speaker, Representative Corey Mason of the 66th Assembly District. I guess that's seen sort of Greater Racine. He's represented that area since 2006. He's also a fifth-generation Racine resident, so definitely part of the fabric of Wisconsin. He's also the ranking Assembly Democrat of the Joint Committee on Finance. And I was excited to discover how involved he is with water issues. That's an area that I'm becoming more engaged in. I've been researching. I researched the successful attempt at stopping water. You know, they tried to privatize water in Milwaukee at one point, not that long ago, and it was successfully stopped. And you know, where I teach, they're starting a water center, and so I'm getting all interested in water issues. And I was excited to discover that he is a former board member of the River Alliance of Wisconsin, a member of the Root River Council, and serves on the Wisconsin Coastal Management Council. So I thought that was pretty cool. But the reason we invited him here tonight is that he introduced Wisconsin's Fair Minimum Wage Act, a bill to raise Wisconsin's minimum wage. This is where I was reminded of what it is, from its paltry $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour, which is at least the start. I mean, of course, that unfortunately didn't go anywhere, but at least he tried, which I thought was a great effort. So let's give a big hand to.
Thank you all very much for having me here tonight. Before I get into my comments, I just want to give a plug to your local representative, Representative Colstein, who's I know not here tonight, but she's just down the hall from me, and there's a great freshman class of members of the Assembly, but Deb is definitely one of the best. She's great. So she's your representative. You are lucky, very lucky to have her. I'm glad she's one of my colleagues, and I've been able to work with her on a number of issues, from student loan debt to minimum wage to any number of things, and she's really a delight to work with. And you know, sometimes within the Democratic caucus, it takes a while to convince my colleagues to do the more progressive route. Deb doesn't need much convincing. She's there. Good. Well, you're lucky to have her. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually hand around a sign-in sheet that has my Twitter feed at the top of it and my Facebook name. But I'll also ask people to sign in with their phone and email. And if you like, I can send you updates on what's going on with the minimum wage, unpaid sick days in terms of that bill that was introduced, along with the efforts that we've been doing on student loan debt. But I'm thrilled to sort of follow up the Carlos from the Workers' Rights Center, just because I think the theme today, they really go hand in hand, is all about the idea of work and dignity, right? The idea that if you have a job, there should be some dignity that comes with that. And part of that, it's an old saying, there should be an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. I mean, that used to be the mantra that you would hear over and over again from people. And so you would think, when we discuss the minimum wage, people have sort of a differing view about that from time to time. And they'll say, well, you know, our governor unfortunately said, you know, those are jobs. Governor Walker said, you know, Paul Ryan and I both had minimum wage jobs at McDonald's when we were teenagers, and I would really hate to deprive young people the opportunity to have that first job. And I think he's really missing the larger point about the minimum wage. It is probably true that the first job you had when you were a teenager, you probably made minimum wage. But it is not true that most people who make the minimum wage are teenagers. And to confuse the two is actually a really dangerous distinction, because in Wisconsin, over 83% of people who earn the minimum wage are not teenagers, right? So we're not talking about somebody getting their first job and making minimum wage. We're talking about a lot of people who are head of households. If I recall the statistic correctly, it's 300,000 to 400,000 children who are in a single-parent household where their sole income for the household is a minimum wage job, right? So it raises this real question about whether or not minimum wage is sufficient and at the right place. And so you debate with people who oppose raising the minimum wage. They think, well, you know, what is this going to mean for employers? What is this going to mean for opportunities? Where would we go? I often ask people to go back to the beginning of the minimum wage. So who knows when the minimum wage was enacted in this country, the federal laws? It was actually done at the height of the Great Depression, which seems counterintuitive to the arguments that people make now about the minimum wage and raising it. They think, well, we're just coming off the recession now. Why on earth would you want to raise the minimum wage? You could really hurt things. But when FDR and the people in power in the federal government did it, it was for a very specific reason. Because we were in the midst of a depression, they didn't want to have a race to the bottom with wages where you might get people back working again, but if you got the entire country living in poverty, but working, well, what good is that? So they established the minimum wage. Interestingly, in our state statutes, when we lay out the minimum wage, obviously it doesn't live up to this, but it actually says in the statutes that the minimum wage is supposed to be a living wage, that it's supposed to be an income that you can live on. And so it's nowhere near that in today's buying power. And so usually when I have conversations with people who have concerns about it and say, we shouldn't raise the minimum wage, I just ask them pointedly, could you live on $7.25 an hour? Could you personally make it on $7.25 an hour? And I can tell sometimes when I ask this question, it's the first time they've really confronted the idea of having to think about it for themselves. But I've never heard anybody say, well, yeah, that would be easy. I can certainly do that. And 10-10 isn't a picnic either, but it basically means that, if you're working 40 hours a week, 50 weeks out of the year, then you might get closer to $19,000, $20,000 a week. So we're not talking about, the median household income in this state, which is right around $50,000. We're talking about just enough that you and one or two kids might eke out just past the poverty line. We're not talking about a fantastic wage. We're not talking about certainly a family supporting wage. We're not talking about what they're doing in Seattle at $15 an hour, but we are talking about something that at least comes close to getting people out of poverty. Now the 10-10 minimum wage, the Fair Minimum Wage Act that I proposed here in Wisconsin, is based almost word for word on what the federal government's trying to do at the national level with their fair minimum wage. So it phases in the minimum wage over 3 steps. And the idea behind it then is it wouldn't be too much of a shock for employers to have to go from $7.25 to $10.10. So it goes up 95 cents when it passes, 95 cents a year after that, and 95 cents a year after that. So within 2 years, you'd have people going from $7.25 to $10.10 an hour. So it phases it in responsibly for those people who think it would have a big economic shock. It gives them sort of an ability to plan and prepare for it. The one thing that the state does our state bill does that's a little different from the federal government though, is it addresses the issue of local control. And this is actually an important component that many people don't think of. But the last time we raised the minimum wage in 2009 in this state to $7.25, it was because Milwaukee and Madison had passed local ordinances to exceed the state's minimum wage. And what you had was employers panicking, saying we can't have multiple minimum wages all over the state and competing, it'll just drive up the cost of wages. What we need to do is just have one minimum wage. And so the deal was cut, perhaps a Faustian one, that said, look, we will raise the minimum wage to $7.25, but as part of that deal, we will make it a state law that prohibits local units of government from raising the minimum wage above the state minimum wage. So now that organizing tool that we used to have that would raise the minimum wage, and you're hearing about it in other cities across the country, it's actually prohibited by state law. So it's an organizing tool that we've lost. Carlos mentioned that there's going to be advisory referenda in as many places as we can manage in the state about whether or not people support raising the minimum wage to $10.10. I'm sure when it's on those ballots, it'll pass overwhelmingly. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to put that in there. My bill, if it were to pass, would actually restore that opportunity to local units of government. And then the other thing that it does, like the federal law, is after the minimum wage goes up to $10.10 in 2 years, it's then indexed to inflation after that. So that we're not constantly having this conversation every 5-7 years about, oh yeah, maybe we should do something about people at the bottom of the income scale. The interesting thing about it is Most legislators get a cost of living adjustment. People who rely on tax breaks at their income levels, all those income levels get adjusted for inflation every year. There's no reason that wage earners at the very bottom of the economic ladder shouldn't enjoy some sort of economic security that at least lets them not fall further and further behind poverty. So that's roughly what we're talking about. Politically, I think this is an interesting issue. We had every Democrat in the Senate vote for it, and every Democrat in the Assembly, save 2, vote for raising the minimum wage to $10.10. And when we poll on it, this is an issue, depending upon the poll that you read, where the American people are way ahead of elected officials. The lowest numbers I saw, I think, were 57%. The highest numbers I saw were well into the 70s. And even some polling done nationally says that more than half of Republicans, including self-described Tea Party members, say that they support raising the minimum wage. And I learned something interesting in this debate about the minimum wage that I hadn't anticipated, because I, like Carlos and others, came at this as a worker dignity issue. Shouldn't you be able to make enough if you're working full time? There's actually an interesting conservative argument about raising the minimum wage, and it's this: why should taxpayers have to subsidize big corporations like Walmart and others that are paying people a substandard minimum wage with food stamps and earned income tax credits and other benefits because they don't want to pay people a decent wage? So believe it or not, there's also been this conservative argument coming in, sort of an anti-corporate welfare argument, a small government argument about, wouldn't people be better off? There was an argument, or an article that came out that said nationally, I believe the number is, the country would save $4.5 billion on food stamps every year if it raised the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. So you can see how it had a positive impact. And then people, that you would not expect to come out in favor of raising the minimum wage have done so. The most notable one in last week was Rick Santorum, a really conservative guy, ran for president 4 years ago, may run again, but he actually said, I don't understand what the Republican hang-up is on minimum wage. If we want to support people going back to work and the dignity of work, we should really get behind it. Former Governor Pawlenty of Minnesota has come out and said, okay, maybe it's not 10-10, but Republicans should really pick a number and get ahead of this issue. Mitt Romney actually says he supports raising it and indexing it. So, we're not in a place where the people who oppose this are not in good company, but unfortunately, given the majorities that we have in the state and the country right now, it's going to take a change in the ballot box before you ultimately see something happen. But the other challenge that I think is out there on the minimum wage is mobilizing voters. And I was thrilled to hear that there's some effort here, perhaps to get an advisory referendum in the Rock County area or in Janesville and Beloit in the municipalities, because we need to give people a reason to come to the polls, right? And this is a motivating factor to be able to do that. I think for some people who we all know that midterm elections have lower turnout than presidential year turnout. We've got an important election coming up. And maybe you're somebody like me who loves Deb Kolsky, and that would be enough for me to get to the poll any day. But if you're not, you don't know a lot about the issues, but you're hearing something about 10-10 is going to be on the ballot, and I'm tired of trying to raise my kids on $7.25 an hour. You might actually take the time in between picking up your kids from childcare and working 2 jobs and whatever else is going on. You might take the time to actually get to the polls. So we actually see this not only as an important policy issue, but a really important political opportunity to send a strong message in as many places as we can. And I hope the organizers who are trying to put this on the ballot in a lot of different places have a lot of success, because I think if we carry the day, and I don't think it would lose in any municipality, I really don't, and we're able to carry the day in a lot of municipalities and come back next session and say, look, it was on the ballot in 20 counties and it passed in all 20 of them, or whatever it might be. I think that helps us. I think that gives us some momentum moving forward. I think I've done my spiel. I will stop there and happily answer any questions that people have about me.